In 2005, a city in Bosnia asked its citizens to vote on a statue. The options were the Pope, Gandhi, and Bruce Lee. The city had survived one of the most brutal ethnic conflicts in modern European history, a war in which neighbors killed neighbors specifically because of who they were. They needed a symbol of unity, someone who belonged to no single group and therefore belonged to everyone. The city of Mostar chose Bruce Lee, and the reason they chose him tells you something about him that none of his films ever could. This is the story of why a man who was rejected by two worlds became the most universal human being of the 20th century. To understand why Mostar chose Bruce Lee, you first have to understand what Mostar had been through. The city sits in southern Bosnia and Herzegovina on the Neretva River, and for centuries it had been a place where different faiths and ethnicities lived in proximity: Bosniaks, Croats, Serbs, with varying degrees of tension and coexistence. Its most famous landmark was the Stari Most, the Old Bridge, a 16th-century Ottoman stone arch that crossed the Neretva and had stood for 400 years as a physical emblem of the city's complex, layered identity. In November 1993, during the Bosnian War, Croatian artillery destroyed the Stari Most. The bridge collapsed into the river below. 16 seconds and 400 years were gone. The destruction was not incidental, it was deliberate. The bridge was a symbol, and it was targeted as a symbol because the war being fought in and around Mostar was a war about symbols, about which identity was legitimate and which was not, about who had the right to exist in which space and under which name. By the time the war ended in 1995, Mostar had been divided along ethnic lines so sharp that different sides of the city functioned as different countries. People who had been neighbors did not cross the river. They could not look at each other without seeing what had been done. The Stari Most was rebuilt and reopened in 2004, a project that took a decade, involved stonemasons from across the region relearning techniques that had been lost for centuries, and required both sides of the divided city to participate in something constructive together. The stones were sourced from the same quarry as the original. The design was as close to the original as scholarship and craft could make it. The reopening ceremony was attended by international dignitaries and by ordinary people of Mostar who had not stood together in one place since before the war. It was a gesture of reconstruction that went beyond the physical. The bridge was back, but the question of what it meant, what it could mean in a city still carrying the weight of what neighbors had done to each other, remained open. In 2005, a group of young people in Mostar, young enough to have experienced the war as children, old enough to understand what had been taken from their city, proposed erecting a statue as part of an ongoing effort to reclaim public space for something other than division. The proposal was simple, and the challenge was enormous. Find a figure who transcended the divisions that had almost destroyed Mostar. Someone who could stand on the bridge or near it and mean something to people on both sides of a city that had been cut in two, not just by a river, but by history, religion, and the memory of violence. The short list they developed contained 3 names: the Pope, John Paul II, who had recently died and whose global significance was beyond question; Gandhi, whose philosophy of nonviolence and reconciliation had been invoked in human conflicts for half a century; and Bruce Lee. The vote went to Bruce Lee. The people who made the choice explained their reasoning in terms that were direct and consistent. Bruce Lee was not Catholic, he was not Hindu, he was not Muslim, he was not Croat, Bosniak, or Serb, he was not European. He had never been to the Balkans. He had no connection to their history, their language, their religion, their conflict. He was a Chinese-American martial artist from Hong Kong who had died in 1973, 32 years before the vote was held. And this was precisely the point. He was the one figure on the list who could not be claimed by any of the groups that had been killing each other. He belonged to none of them, and therefore, for a city trying to remember what it meant to share a space with people who were different from you, he could belong to all of them. What the people of Mostar understood intuitively, what they expressed through this choice more eloquently than most academic arguments manage to express in thousands of words, is that Bruce Lee's identity had always been defined by its refusal to be contained by any single category. He had lived his entire life in the space between classifications that other people tried to force him into, and he had refused every one of them. He was born in San Francisco in 1940 to a Chinese opera singer father and a mother of mixed Chinese and European ancestry whose exact lineage has never been definitively established. Some accounts say German-Jewish on her mother's side, others say English, the records incomplete and contested in ways that seem almost fitting given what the ambiguity did for the man who carried it. He was given an American birth certificate and a Chinese name simultaneously, Li Junfan in Chinese, Bruce Lee in English, a dual naming that anticipated the dual existence his life would become. 3 months after he was born, his family returned to Hong Kong, where he spent his childhood and adolescence. In Hong Kong, he was considered not entirely Chinese. His mixed heritage was visible. Lighter skin, rounder eyes than the norm, and in the social context of 1950s Kowloon, this was not a neutral fact. Other children noticed and said things about it. The martial arts community noticed and acted on it. The students at Ip Man's Wing Chun School, when they learned of his ancestry, petitioned for his removal on the grounds that Chinese martial knowledge should not be transmitted to someone of impure Chinese blood. Ip Man resisted for a time, but ultimately compromised, separating Bruce from the main class and arranging for his instruction to continue separately through a senior student. He was, in the community that should have been most naturally his own, treated as someone who did not fully belong, tolerated rather than embraced, accommodated rather than included. In 1959, his parents sent him to America, to Seattle, then to San Francisco, then to Los Angeles. He was 18 years old, with a few dollars in his pocket, a foundational knowledge of Wing Chun that he had not been allowed to complete, and an absolute certainty about his own ability that no amount of institutional rejection had managed to dislodge. In America, he encountered a different version of the same problem. He was not American enough. Not in the way that the film industry understood American, which in practice meant not white. The studios that were happy to use his talent as a fighting instructor, as a fight choreographer for their white stars, as a supporting player in someone else's story, were not willing to put his face at the center of a narrative. The calculation was stated plainly. American audiences were not ready for an Asian leading man. When Bruce created the concept for a television series about a Chinese martial artist in the American West, a character who was in many ways a portrait of his own condition, a man who belonged fully to neither the world he came from nor the world he moved through, the studio took the concept, recast it with a white actor, and called it Kung Fu. The reason given was his race. The show ran for 3 successful seasons without him. His students, McQueen, Coburn, Kareem, were on screens all over the world. He was still waiting for a door to open. So he had been not Chinese enough for Hong Kong and not American enough for Hollywood. He occupied, in both systems, the category of the person who almost belongs but not quite, the category that every bureaucracy of identity produces when it encounters someone whose existence does not fit its boxes. Most people in this category find a way to choose. They perform one identity more loudly than the other. They file down the edges that do not fit. They make themselves smaller in one direction so they can fit through a door in another. But here is what Bruce Lee did with this condition that made him unique.
He did not assimilate. He did not spend his energy fighting for the right to belong to one category or the other. He rejected the premise entirely. He said in an interview with Canadian journalist Pierre Berton in 1971, a televised interview that has since become one of the most studied documents in the Bruce Lee archive, the words that have been quoted more than almost anything else he ever said. "I think of myself as a human being, because under the sky we are but one family. It just so happens that we look different." Berton had asked the question directly, "Do you consider yourself Chinese or North American?" What he got was something that stopped the conversation, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so completely, unfussily true. Bruce did not say he was both. He did not say he was neither. He declined the terms of the question and offered a different category entirely. Human being, one family. It just so happens that we look different.
He was not performing this position for an audience. The notebooks his family found after his death, thousands of pages of private writing, written with no expectation of publication, contained the same idea expressed repeatedly in different forms through different metaphors. He wrote about it when he was frustrated and when he was at peace, in the context of martial arts and in the context of his career. It was not a philosophy adopted for public consumption. It was the conclusion he had reached through the specific experience of being someone that every available system of classification had failed to adequately describe. This is what Jeet Kune Do was at its philosophical core, not a fighting system, a manifesto of refusal. A systematic rejection of the idea that the box you were placed in determined what you were allowed to do or become. Absorb what is useful, discard what is not, add what is essentially your own. This was not a description of how to throw a punch. It was a description of how to build a life when every available template has already told you that you do not fit. The first student Bruce Lee ever taught in America was Jesse Glover, a black man from Seattle, working class, someone who would have been turned away without discussion at the door of virtually every Chinese martial arts school in the country. Bruce took him on without hesitation or condition. He built a school in Seattle and then in Oakland and then informally across Los Angeles through private instruction that admitted anyone who was willing to learn seriously. What had been done to him at Ip Man's school, he refused to replicate. The personal became structural without ever being announced as policy. He simply opened the door that had been closed to him and held it open for everyone who came after. By 1973, when he died, Bruce Lee had become the most recognizable Asian face in the world. He had done it on his own terms, in his own way, without becoming the version of himself that either Hollywood or Hong Kong had wanted him to create. He had fought Warner Bros. For the right to make Enter the Dragon on his terms, demanded final cut, script approval, a percentage of the gross, a co-production structure that gave him genuine ownership rather than the performing animal deal that the studio had initially offered. He had made the film he wanted to make with himself at the center of it, and he had been proven right by a global audience that did not care about the demographic calculations of studio executives in Los Angeles. He died 6 days before Enter the Dragon opened. He never saw what it became. But what it became and what he became in the decades after his death was something that no single culture or nation could claim as its own. His image appeared on walls in Harlem and in Bangkok, in Lagos and in Berlin, in Sao Paulo and in Jakarta. His philosophy was quoted by professional fighters and by management consultants, by Zen practitioners and by hip-hop artists, by people who had never watched a single Bruce Lee film and by people who had watched them so many times the tapes wore out. He had become, in the specific way that very few human beings ever become, a figure who meant something to people who had nothing else in common.
A 2021 survey found that 42% of Americans could not name a single prominent Asian American. 7% named Jackie Chan. But ask anywhere in the world who Bruce Lee is, and the answer comes back instantly, in every language, from people of every age and background. The reach of his identity extended precisely because his identity refused to stop at any border. And in 2005, in a city in Bosnia that was trying to find its way back to itself after a war fought in the name of the very categories Bruce Lee had spent his life refusing, the people voted. The Pope, with all the weight of one of the world's great religious traditions, did not win. Gandhi, with all the weight of one of history's great political and spiritual legacies, did not win. Bruce Lee won, because he was the one figure on the list who could not be used as a weapon by any side against any other, because he belonged to the kind of human experience that does not require you to be a particular thing before you are allowed in. The bronze statue of Bruce Lee was unveiled on November 26, 2005, the day before what would have been his 65th birthday. It stood near the Starry Most, the bridge that had been destroyed and painstakingly rebuilt, the bridge that was trying to mean something new for a city that had nearly destroyed itself over the question of difference. The statue showed Bruce Lee in his characteristic fighting stance, looking out over the Neretva River, in a city he never visited, on a continent he passed through only briefly. A plaque at its base described him as a symbol of anti-discrimination and the struggle against ethnic division. The statue was vandalized 3 times in its first 2 years. Each time it was repaired, each time it returned. The people who vandalized it were making a different argument, the argument that identity is a weapon and that symbols must be claimed by someone or belong to no one. The people who repaired it were making Bruce Lee's argument back at them, that belonging to no single tribe is not a weakness, but the only condition from which genuine solidarity becomes possible. The statue still stands. Bruce Lee still looks out over the river. The bridge below him is the same bridge that was blown up and rebuilt, the same stones in the same arch, carrying the same traffic across the same water. Under the sky, they are but one family. It just so happens that they look different. If this story moved you, subscribe and leave a comment. What do you think it means that a city torn apart by ethnic hatred chose Bruce Lee as its symbol of unity? Share this video with someone who needs to hear that belonging everywhere and nowhere at the same time might be the most powerful kind of freedom there is.